Good to see everybody at the house of God. Wayne's already said this morning. Glad he's given us a beautiful day. Be able to come back to the house of God and worship the Lord. I hope we came today for that reason. Worship the Lord today, spirit and in truth. I know we'll worship Him in truth. We always do around here. We have the truth of the Word of God in our singing, our teaching, our preaching. We know that. And I hope we'll be able to worship Him in spirit as well today. Job chapter 15. If you want to turn back, Job chapter 15. We'll start back where we left off last week. We had started talking about Eliphaz here in his second speech to Job here in chapter number 15. We'll start back there here in just a minute. But we'll have a word of prayer here before we get into the lesson as we normally do. Brother Wayne, will you open us up in prayer, sir?
Dear Lord, we come to you again just like this day, now in my God, and your Lord, I pray you touch now in the service today. I pray you stand at the end of your spirit, Lord, and open our hearts to the Word of God. Lord, we thank you for all the teachers, help them, turn their hearts to study, let's pray, help them. You know how I always study, Lord, I pray you step in today. May our hearts be open to what you're not working today. Yes, Lord. All these things we ask in Jesus' name.
Man, thank you, Brother Wayne. All right, just a quick recap of what we talked about last week before we get back into the lesson today. We had been looking at Job's response actually to Zophar's accusations. And Job, he responded to Zophar's accusations by talking about three different things in chapter 12. Chapter 13, chapter number 14. Chapter number 12, he talked about the greatness of God. Because Zophar had said, you're ignorant of God, you don't have the knowledge of God. So he rebuked him, showed him how he was wrong because he did know about the knowledge of God. So he talked about the greatness of God. Then he talked about the integrity of himself, of Job. He's trying to prove his integrity once again and continue his thought about how he has maintained his integrity through all the suffering and all the trials he was going through. And in chapter number 14, he started talking about how hopeless he felt again. We've talked about that several times, and that's the recurring theme when Job talks. He just felt hopeless because of all the things that was going on in his life. And then Eliphaz, again here, this is where we got started last week. He makes his second speech here, starting in chapter number 15, and he issues two warnings to Job. First, he tells Job that he lacks wisdom. And then he tells Job that, look, Job, he said, God is going to judge the wicked. So we started looking at the first one. We got through verses 1 through 4. And we ended up talking about how Job's friends, they always thought that the only motive for serving God was fear of punishment. And that there was no other reason that you should serve God but because of that. But we know that the true motive and the highest motive for serving the Lord needs to be love, not fear, because you're going to get punished or whatever if you don't. And that's what we were talking about last week. And we talked a little bit how about when Israel was just becoming a nation, that's how God dealt with them. You know how you deal with young children. We talked about that a little bit last week. That's what they understand, right? Fear, if you don't do this, you got this consequence. That's typically how you have to deal with younger children. But as you get older, that changes. And we see where that did change with Moses. When the new generation was about to cross over into the land of Canaan, he gave them a higher motive. He gave the children of Israel a higher motive for serving the Lord, and that was love. We looked at some of those scriptures last week, and that's where I'll take up today. Let me just give you a few of those verses, and then we'll actually start back here in verse 5 in the lesson here just in a minute. But again, here's some more verses that Moses gave the children of Israel before they were going to cross over into Canaan, talking about how they needed to love the Lord, and that needed to be their motive for serving Him. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse number 1. Therefore shalt thou love the Lord thy God, and keep His charge and His statutes, and His judgments, and His commandments alway. Deuteronomy 11, verse 13. And it shall come to pass, if ye shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love the Lord your God, and to serve Him with all your heart and with all your soul. Deuteronomy 11, verse 22. For if ye diligently keep all His commandments, which I command you to do them, to love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to cleave unto Him. And then one more, Deuteronomy 19, verse number 9. If thou shalt keep all these commandments to do them, which I command thee this day, to love the Lord thy God, and to walk ever in His ways, and thou shalt add 3 cities more for thee, besides these 3. So if you notice, almost all four of these verses here that I read is about basically the same thing, and you need to keep my commandments, but you need to love the Lord your God. And that's where Moses, he's reaffirming that the motive for serving the Lord needs to be love and not necessarily fear. And we see that also in some New Testament scriptures. Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, the Bible says, "Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law." And then one more, John chapter 14, verse number 15, and of course this is where Jesus was talking to his disciples. He says, "If you love me, keep my commandments." So that theme continues on in the New Testament, and we need to remember the motive for serving the Lord needs to be love, not fear, because we may get punished or whatever the case may be from God, but we need to serve the Lord because of love, and that needs to be our highest motive. Okay, now back into the lesson, chapter 15. Let me read verses 5 and 6. And again, this is Eliphaz here, and he's continuing his warning to Job, and he tells Job in the first 14 or 15 verses here, he says, "Job, you lack wisdom." So let's take up here verse 5. Job 15, verse 5. "For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I. Yea, thine own lips testify against me." So Eliphaz, he had already he had made some opinions about Job, and one of them here in these few verses, it seems that he thought that maybe Job had a wicked heart here in these verses 5 and 6, and he's basically saying here in these verses to Job, in these two verses, he says, "Job, your sins are telling your mouth what to say." And we have an example of that in Matthew chapter 12, verses 34 through 37. This is Jesus talking. He says, "O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. A good man out of the good treasure of the heart bringeth forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure bringeth forth evil things. But I say unto you that every idle word that man shall speak, they shall give an account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be justified, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned." But Eliphaz, he had it all wrong here. Job was not condemning himself by the words he was saying, but that's what Eliphaz, that was his opinion, and that's what he was thinking, and that is true. These verses I read, Matthew chapter 12, that last verse, "For by thy words thou shalt be justified, or by thy words thou shalt be condemned." So, we do have to be careful of what we say, because, it could come back to bite us sometimes. So we do have to be careful about what we say. But what Eliphaz was saying here about Job was just not true. And let's go on to verses 7 through 10. Let me read those verses here. Verse 7 says, "Art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God? Dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou, which is not in us? With us are both the gray-headed and the very aged men, much elder than thy father." So again, Eliphaz, he's continuing here, and he tells Job that he thinks Job lacks wisdom because of his lack of experience. But notice some of these claims here that Eliphaz seems to think that Job had made. Job never made these kind of claims. Verse number 7, Job never claimed that he was the first man that God created. Verse number 8, Job never claimed to be God's confidant, if you will, and that word just means a person with whom we may share secrets with. And Job never claimed to be that kind of person. And then verse number 8 as well, Job never claimed to have a monopoly on the wisdom of God, but these seems like that Eliphaz was claiming that Job had made some of these claims. And also verse number 10, we've talked about it already. Job, he knew that his friends were older than he was, but as we've discussed already several times, age does not always guarantee wisdom, but we know Job's friends thought that because they were older. They felt they were wiser, and they knew more, and they knew better, but that was not necessarily the case. But we see here Eliphaz, he's a good debater. And I don't know if any of you have ever debated much, but one of the tactics sometimes that a debater uses he is that if you can't refute the speech, or if you can't prove the speech wrong, then you just ridicule the speaker. And I'm sure you've seen that a lot, especially in the last several years with some of the political campaigns that's been going on. If they can't refute the speech of the person they're debating against, they just start talking about them and ridiculing them. And that's what Eliphaz here was doing. He was a debater, and that's what he was trying to do here to Job. He couldn't refute Job's speech and the things he said. He couldn't prove the things Job was saying was wrong. So he was just trying to ridicule him here in some of these verses. All right, let's go on to verses 11 through 13 and read those, see what else Eliphaz has to say here. Verse 11, are the constellations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away, and what do thy eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirits against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. So Eliphaz, he thought here that his words, as well as the other two friends, Bildad and Zophar, that had already spoke as well, he thought their words were words of constellations. That's what he said, verse 11. Are the constellations of God small with thee? But then he goes on to in verse number 13, and he says, but Job, your words are spoken in anger. Our words are spoken to help you and to console you. And we know that just simply so far has not been the case. But he said, Job, your words, they're spoken in anger. In other words, we're serving God, Job, of what we're trying to do, but you're just simply trying to resist God. You're not accepting what we're trying to tell you, and we're trying to help you. So that's what Eliphaz was saying about his words as well as the words of the other two friends. And then verses 14 through 16, let's read those. Again, he's still finishing up here, telling Job he just lacks wisdom on some of these things. Verses 14 through 16, what is man, that he should be clean, and he which is born of a woman, that he should be righteous? Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints. Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water? So he just repeats his message here from his first speech that says man is not innocent and man is not righteous. And he's saying, Job, you're no exception. You're not innocent and you're not righteous either. And again, continuing up here, trying to tell Job he just lacks wisdom, doesn't understand these things. And so that brings us into his second warning here in the rest of the chapter. And his second warning to Job is that God judges the wicked. And we know that he does. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I think his friends were a little confused about exactly how God goes about doing that. Now remember, in Eliphaz's first speech, he seemed to describe the blessings of a godly man in his first speech to Job. But now he starts describing the sufferings of an ungodly man. So let's read verses 17 through 19 and see here a couple of things he has to say. He says, I will show thee, hear me, and that which I have seen I will declare, which wise men have told from their fathers and have not hid it, unto whom alone the earth was given, and no stranger passed among them. So he was clear to point out to Job here that these was not only his ideas, but it was the ancients or the forefathers that agreed with him as well. And again, going back we talked about tradition. They based a lot of this stuff and their beliefs on tradition and on their forefathers, some things that they thought. So that's how he starts here by describing the ungodly man. He says, look, not only my idea, but other men, aged men, older than me, agree with these things as well. But let's look at the description here that he actually gives of an ungodly or a wicked man. And as we read some of these verses, just think about Job and what's going on in his life. And I think we can see that Eliphaz is not just necessarily in general talking about the wicked or the ungodly man, but he's probably talking about Job and some of the things he's saying. So let me read here verses 20 through 33. Look at some of the things Eliphaz has to say about an ungodly or wicked man. It says, verse number 20, the wicked man travaileth with pain all his days, and the number of his years is hidden to the oppressor. A dreadful sound is in his ears, and prosperity of the destroyer shall come upon him. He believeth not that he shall return out of darkness, and he is waited for of the sword. He wandereth abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knoweth that the day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish shall make him afraid. They shall prevail against him as a king ready to the battle. For he stretched out his hand against God, and strengtheneth himself against the Almighty. He runneth upon him, even on his neck, and upon the thick bosses of his buckler, because he covereth his face with the fatness, and maketh collops of fat on his flanks. He And he dwelleth in desolate cities and in houses which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue, neither shall he prolong the perfection thereof upon the earth. He shall not depart out of darkness, the flame shall dry up his branches, and by the breath of his mouth shall he go away. Let not him that is deceived trust in vanity, for vanity shall be his recompense. It shall be accomplished before his time, and his branch shall not be green. He shall shake off his unripe grape as the vine, and shall cast off his flower as the olive. So several different things here that he uses to describe this ungodly or this wicked man. Verse number 20, he talks about how he travaileth with pain. You know, and we know that's happening to Job, right? Verse number 20, he says, a wicked man travaileth in pain all his days, and the number of his years is hidden to the oppressor. Because he could be speaking about Job there, talking about he travails in pain. In verse number 21, also in verse number 30, it speaks maybe about how the invaders destroyed his livestock. You remember how the fire came down from heaven and destroyed a lot of the stuff that Job had back over in chapter number 1. So, and his friends, you know, they knew all that. So he was probably talking about Job in that. In verse number 29 talks about he shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue. So he talks about how he lost his wealth, and we know that's exactly what happened to Job. Job not only lost his family and his livestock and everything, but in his house, but he lost all his wealth as well. And in verse number 28, could that be talking about how his eldest son's house was destroyed and his children with it? He says, he that dwelleth in desolate cities and his houses, which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. You know, that could be talking about how his eldest son's house was destroyed. So clearly, it's pretty easy to see here in these verses when he's describing this ungodly or this wicked man that he's talking about Job and not just in general terms here, I believe. Let's look at Eliphaz's closing remarks here in verses 34 through 35, and then we'll get on into chapter 16 and see where Job starts his answer. But Job 15 verses 34, for the congregation of the hypocrites shall be desolate, and fire shall consume the tabernacles of bribery. They conceive mischief and bring forth vanity, and their belly prepareth deceit. So Eliphaz here in his closing words, he's basically telling Job that he's just a hypocrite and he's a godless man here in these verses. And it's interesting to note, if you've been reading some in Job, and I hope you have already, that the word hypocrite is a key word in the vocabulary of Job's friends when they're talking to him. They're all the times, multiple times, they refer to Job as a hypocrite. Eliphaz did here. Verse number 34, as we just read that. And then Bildad, we've already talked about that back over in chapter 8, verse number 13. He says, so are the paths of all that forget God, and the hypocrite's hope shall perish. So Bildad, he called Job a hypocrite. And then Zophar will again, when we get to chapter number 20, verse number 5, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite but for a moment. So Zophar, he jumps on the bandwagon as well, talking about how he's a hypocrite. And then Elihu, later on, it'll be several weeks down the road when we get there, but when he comes on the scene and he starts talking to Job and trying to straighten him out, he calls him hypocrite a couple different times. Chapter 34, verse number 30, that the hypocrite reign not, lest the people be ensnared. And also chapter 36, verse 13, but the hypocrites in heart heap up wrath, but cry not when he bindeth them. So again, they're calling Job a hypocrite, but again, Job continues to deny it because his friends have not been able to prove it whatsoever that Job is actually a hypocrite in any form or fashion. So Eliphaz here, he finishes up here his second speech to Job, and again, he talks about how he lacked wisdom and then how that God is going to judge the wicked. And again, I mentioned that earlier. Granted, God will judge the wicked, and we know the wicked will be judged, but it may not necessarily be in this lifetime, as Job's three friends always insisted. They always insisted, there's no doubt, that the wicked are going to be punished in this lifetime, and that they believe that, and that they stood upon that. But, you know, that may not necessarily always be the case. And we discussed that some already. Psalm 73, Asaph's psalm, we talked about that a few weeks ago. You know how Asaph, he couldn't understand why the wicked seemed to just prosper, and then the righteous just seemed to always be suffering, everything going wrong for him. He said, till I entered in the congregation, he said, then I understood their end. We also understand that God sends sunshine and he sends rain both on the just and on the unjust. Matthew 5, verse 45 tells us that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. So we have to remember that, you know, we may not fully understand why it happens, but we know the Word of God is true, and it tells us that there's going to be sunshine on the good, there's going to be sunshine on the bad, there's going to be rain on the good, there's going to be rain on the bad. But one thing we have to keep in mind, and this is kind of what Asaph talked about in Psalm 73. He talked about how the only heaven that the wicked will experience is going to be here on earth, right? Because hell is what awaits the wicked.
Right.
But we also have to keep in mind that the only suffering that the godly are going to experience is going to be here on earth, because heaven awaits them. And it's really important that we remember those things, those two things. It's very important for going through trials and suffering and tribulations in our lives to remember those things. Let me give you some scriptures to kind of go along with this, how that the wicked, their only heaven's going to be here, and the godly, their only suffering is going to be here. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 8 says, wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, ye are in heaviness through manifold temptations, that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen ye love, whom though now you see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. What about 1 Peter 5, verse number 10? But the God of all grace, who hath called us unto his eternal glory by Jesus Christ, after that ye have suffered a while, make you perfect, establish, strengthen, settle you. What about 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18? I've read these probably 2 or 3 times already during the lesson, and these are very important verses to remember too while we're studying here the book of Job and the life of Job. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 16, for which cause we faint not, though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And then one more, Romans 8, verse 18, very familiar scripture. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. So just some very important scriptures that if we're struggling and we're suffering, we're going through trials, we just need to remember these verses. They should be comfort to us. And remember, what would Job have given for verses like this? See, he didn't have these verses. Remember, we've talked about that many times already. Job was the oldest book probably written, so the law was not even written probably when Job was around. So he didn't have these scriptures that we have today that we can get comfort and we can get consolation, we can get peace from these verses that we currently have today. All right, now let's get into chapter number 16, and we see Job in chapter 16 and 17. He answers, or he replies here to Eliphaz's second speech in these 2 chapters. And in chapter number 16 and 17, both of them, they go together. There's 3 different pleas that Job gives in these 2 chapters. First, he has and it's pretty much more of and you've probably seen that already. You've seen the narrative. He kind of talks about the same things a lot over and over. He's just trying to get it across how he feels and how he thinks that, he thinks that he's been given an injustice. I mean, Job, that's pretty much what he thinks in his life. And he's just expressing that. I mean, I think a lot of times we talk about Job when we're talking about suffering and trial, and it's kind of like we put Job way up here, and he is a good example for us when it comes to trials and testings. But if we, by reading and studying and really looking at these chapters, chapter after chapter, we see the human side of Job, and he was human, just like you are, just like I am. Right. And we see some of the things he was feeling, and he actually expressed those feelings in these writings here. That's why I thought it was important that we look at the whole book and not just a couple, 2 or 3 chapters in the book of Job. So the 3 pleas here that Job has, 2 of them are in chapter number 16. First, he has a plea for sympathy again from his friends. And this is not the first time that he's done this, but he does it again. And then the second half of chapter number 16, we see he has a plea to God for justice. Remember, I just mentioned, he thinks he's been given an injustice in his life by the things that are going on in his life, so he has a plea for justice to God. Then in chapter number 17, he does actually have a plea for death. So these sufferings will end, and we've talked about that already multiple times so far. Job has talked about how he thought he would be better off if he had never even been born. So we'll look at that again when we get into chapter number 17. But first, in chapter number 16, let's look at this plea for sympathy here from his friends. And let me read verses 1 through 14, and then go back and look at a few things that he has to say about his friends. All right, Job 16, verse number 1. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. Shall vain words have an end? Or what emboldeneth thee that thou answerest? I also could speak as ye do. If your soul were in my soul's stead, I could heap up words against you, and shake mine head at you. But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips, so to assuage your grief. Though I speak, my grief is not assuaged, and though I forbear, what am I eased? But now he hath made me weary. Thou hast made desolate all my company, and thou hast filled me with wrinkles, which is a witness against me, and my leanness rising up in me beareth witness to my face. He teareth me in his wrath, who hateth me. He gnasheth upon me with his teeth. Mine enemy sharpened his eye upon me. They have gaped upon me with their mouth. They have smitten me upon the cheek reproachfully. They have gathered themselves together against me. God hath delivered me to the ungodly, and turned me over to the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he hath broken me asunder. He hath also taken me by my neck, shaken me to pieces, and set me up for his mark. His archers compass me round about. He cleaveth my reins asunder, and doeth not spare. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. He breaketh me with breach upon breach. He runneth upon me like a giant. So he has Job here, he's pleading to his friends. He said, come on, give me some sympathy. Y'all haven't been helping me with y'all's words and the things you've been saying to me. And we know Job, remember, he's already called his friends several different things. Remember, he called them forgers of lies, and then he called them physicians of no value. Well, now, in verse number 2 here, chapter number 16, he just flat out calls them miserable comforters. In verse number 2, he says, miserable comforters are you all. So we've been able to see that easily so far in our study here of the book of Job. And you've heard it 1,000 times, with friends like this, why do you need enemies if you got friends like this? I know you've heard that 1,000 times, but it is true. And that's what he's saying here in verse number 2. Then in verse number 4, he's saying, look, he says, if the tables were turned, he said, I could say the same things against you as you're saying against me. Verse number 4, he says, I could heap up words against you if I wanted to. But look what he says in verse number 5. He says, but I would not. He said, I'd try to be sympathetic, and I'd try to encourage you. And that word assuage there, he talks about, verse number 5, but I will strengthen you, yea, with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief. And that means to just make less intense. And Job was that kind of man. If the tables were turned, Job, I believe, would have been giving his friends some comforting words to try to make their grief and their sufferings and their sorrow maybe less intense. But notice verse number 6, what he says as well. I thought this was interesting. He says, though I speak, my grief is not assuaged, and though I forbear, what am I at ease? So he's saying whether I speak or whether I keep silence, he said, my grief, it doesn't change. He says, I'm not able to encourage myself. I mean, he was so low that he couldn't even try to encourage himself. Remember the story, very familiar, how David once encouraged himself in the Lord, but Job was so low he wasn't even able to do that. So he was depending on his friends to try to do that for him, and they weren't doing it. They weren't helping him at all. And in verse number 7, he talks about how he tells his friends here that he's just worn out and is weak. And he says his family's gone. Remember, he had lost all his family, and he was desolate, and he was alone. And he needed some sympathy from them. And in verse number 8 through 10, he talks about how men have been attacking him here in some of these verses. Look at some of the things he has to say. In verse number 8, he says, they filled me with wrinkles, in verse number 8. And then also in verse number 9, he says, they teareth me. And also in verse number 9, he says, they gnasheth upon me. And in verse number 9 as well, he says, they sharpened their eyes upon me. And in verse number 10, he says, they have gaped upon me with their mouth. And you know what that means? If somebody tells you something that's kind of astonishing or whatever, you just kind of like that, you just kind of do that. Well, that's what they were doing here. It talks about they gaped upon him with their mouth, and that's what that means. In verse number 10, it says, they've smitten me. And in verse number 10 again, he talks about how they've gathered against me. So his friends here, they were not helping him at all. They were actually hindering him more so than they were helping him. And he's just talking about that here, how they were attacking him here in these verses. And then in verses 11 through 14, in Job's opinion, or this is at least the way Job felt, he felt like God was attacking him as well. Verse number 11, he talks about how he thought that God had delivered him to the ungodly and turned him over to the hands of the wicked. In verse number 12, he talks about how he was at ease, but he says, then God has broken me. And then in verse number 12 as well, he talks about how he says, God has shaken me to pieces and set me up for his mark. And then verse number 18 talks about the archers again are compassing him. And we talked about that earlier one other time. He felt like that he was just being shot at with arrows of the wicked and different things. And even in this particular instance, he thinks God's the one that is doing that. And then verse number 13, he talks about how he cleaveth my reins asunder. And the word reins there could be talking about his emotions. It says my emotions are cleaved asunder. Let me finish up these verse 14 here, and then we'll start in verse 15 next week. He says, he poureth out my gall, in verse number 13. And that gall is probably referring to his bitterness of spirit. And we talked about how Job had gotten a little bitter because of the things that were going on in his life. In verse 14 as well, he talks about how God is breaking me. He says, he breaketh me with breach upon breach. And then also he finishes up verse 14, says, he runneth upon me like a giant. And so Job felt like that even God was against him. He says, I know my friends are against me. And it's seemingly like, he says to me, it feels like God's against me too. So he says, where can I turn? Or where can I go? And then that's where he starts his plea for justice in verse 15. Lord willing, that's where we'll take up next week, Job chapter 16, verse number 15. If you'll read your lesson, Lord willing, we'll start back there next week. Thank you.